My dear brothers and sisters here at Holy Cross, we continue with our series on Paul's letter to the Romans as we crawl through chapter 3. We're now on verses 7 and 8. And I know that many of you are thinking, when will this end? And my answer to you is at least before the second coming. So you have that to hope for. All right, Paul begins chapter 3, verse 7. But if through my falsehood God's truthfulness abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not say, as some people slander us by saying that we say, let us do evil so that good may come. Their condemnation is deserved. All right. Paul here is saying, but if through my falsehood God's truthfulness abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? This is a carryover from what we've been talking about in the last few verses. That, look, just because your sin shines a good light on God, in other words, what Paul is really saying there is this gap between our behavior and the expectation that God has on us. And when we act poorly or sinfully, anybody with eyes can see that there's a gap and can see this is where God is over here and this is where these slubby people are over here. And so it shines a light that contrasts God from us. But he says, look, if you act poorly, if I act poorly, guess what? We deserve to be condemned. Now, as I said before, this condemnation is not just about us being thrown into the dark, deep, miserable, dank depths of hell. That's not what this is about. This is about what it means to be who we're called to be by God. So, part of what he's saying here is this. You know, I know, we're all called to be better. Just because something has a good outcome, but you didn't do a good job, doesn't mean that you should continue to do a bad job. If you sinned and something good happened because of it, don't continue to sin. Maybe you want to strive for that outcome, but don't strive to sin anymore. Now, part of what he's saying here is this. On the one hand, the Jewish Pharisees want to say, you see, Paul, you're letting everybody off the hook with this notion of God's faithfulness. You see, you keep saying that well, our faithfulness has nothing to do with God's faithfulness. You keep breaking in some ways this covenant. God gave us a covenant, he would say. The Pharisees would say, and so we have to hold up our end of the bargain. And you're letting off these slubby sinners. No, Paul says, God will always be faithful, and God will always be just, and God will always be merciful, and God will always be loving. But he also always calls us to enter into each and every one of those aspects of God's life. In fact, that's why he sent Jesus to be with us, so that we would see what it looks like to act out this type of behavior that God calls us to. You want to know what love looks like? See Jesus healing the blind. You want to know what God's faithfulness looks like? See Jesus hanging on the cross. You want to know what God's forgiveness looks like? See Jesus hanging on the cross. You want to know what God's life triumph over death looks like? See the wounds of the resurrected Jesus. Anywhere you look in Jesus' life and death and ministry, there he is showing us what it is that God asks of us. Now, Jesus knows we're not going to be Jesus, but what he does say is, keep following me, and keep asking for forgiveness. See, that's a deep part of what Jesus says. See, Jesus isn't saying you're going to be perfect. Not today, not tomorrow, not 100 years in the future. Don't worry about it, because you can always ask for forgiveness, because God is always giving us his forgiveness unconditional of our sinfulness. Now, on the other side, from the Pharisees, he's got these Greeks and these Gentiles and these people from the far-off land saying, oh, if bad behavior shines a good light on God, well, let's keep sinning, because then people will see God's grace. And he said, no. You don't get to keep being a pagan. You don't get to just keep killing people because, well, it's in the name of God. You don't keep getting to go to the temple and have sex with prostitutes. No, none of that. You have to act out what the goodness of God looks like in Jesus Christ. And that love and that justice and that forgiveness and that faithfulness is always pulling on us so that we might ourselves turn again to who God is and once again offer forgiveness to our brothers and sisters and even to ourselves. But most of all, to open our heart to God's forgiveness. Now, he says, this idea of let us do evil so that good may come, that's empty. You want God's life and love. You want God's sense of goodness to rain down upon you. Do what you know is good, even if it's difficult and hard. He says their condemnation is deserved. In other words, this idea of cheap grace, that we just get grace no matter what we do. That cheap grace, guess what? Condemn it. That idea that we're never forgiven because we're not living into the covenant of the law, that's also bupkis. This idea that we're always being called to be better, and yet we're also always forgiven and always loved and always called back to God's goodness and God's justice, rooted in and through Jesus Christ. That is what we as Christians are called to. Now, Paul goes on in verse 9, and he says, what then? Are we any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin. In other words, what Paul is saying here is, look, you're not any better off if you keep sinning. You're not any better off if you just keep doing what you did before you knew who Jesus was. Look, you all came to Jesus because you knew there was something powerful that Jesus offered that you couldn't get from the law, that you couldn't get from the pagan temple, that you couldn't get from your brother or sister or some wise man or magician. You knew when you heard the words of Jesus Christ that there was something being offered here that you needed, that every single person needs. That redemption of God given to us in the flesh. And he says, look, all people, before they knew Jesus, well, they were under the power of sin. And Paul says, look, we're all working it the best we can as Christians to keep turning away from the sin and coming back once again to God. Now, I got to tell you, in my life, that's messy. It's difficult. I'm not a robot. I eat too much. Some days I even drink too much. Geez, don't tell my parishioners I said that. Some days I get out of bed and I struggle to be nice to anybody who sees me for a couple of hours. If you want verification about that, ask my wife or my daughter. The point is this. This business of becoming who we're called to be in and through Jesus Christ is not all at once. Now, some of you may know the day and the place and the time when you were saved, when you turned for the first time to Jesus Christ. But guess what? Jesus kept calling his disciples to come a little bit further each day and to follow him in those hard places. And Paul knew that. Yes, we might have had an origin date in which we came to Jesus, but we're all working the program each and every day, trying to figure out how a little bit more we can live into that faithfulness and that justice and that love of God. Amen, and God bless.